A widow and her 2 daughters saved a millionaire, but what he did with his daughters changed everything. Welcome to another thrilling story. Please subscribe to the channel so we can bring you more thrilling stories. The storm that evening was merciless, battering the outskirts of Manchester, with sheets of rain that turned the narrow country roads into rivers of mud. Helen pulled her worn coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried along the path, her twin daughters Lydia and Maisie struggling to keep pace beside her. At 15, the girls were old enough to help their mother navigate the treacherous evening, but young enough to still seek the comfort of her presence during the worst of the weather. "Mum, look!" Maisie's voice cut through the howling wind, her finger pointing toward a dark shape beside the road ahead. Helen squinted through the rain and felt her heart drop. A sleek black car lay overturned in the ditch, its expensive paint scratched and dented from the impact. Steam rose from beneath the crumpled hood, and one of the headlights flickered weakly before dying completely. "Stay back, girls," Helen instructed, but her feet were already carrying her toward the wreckage. Years of cleaning offices had taught her to notice details others might miss, and she could see the driver's door was slightly ajar. Inside, slumped against the steering wheel, was a man in an expensive suit. His dark hair was matted with blood from a gash on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow but steady. Helen's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. "Is he alive?" Lydia whispered, pressing close to her mother's side. "Yes, love. Help me get him out." Helen's voice was steady despite her racing heart. She had no idea who this man was, or how he'd ended up in their small corner of the world, but she knew she couldn't leave him there. Working together, the 3 women managed to carefully extract the unconscious stranger from his vehicle. He was heavier than he looked, and Helen could tell from his clothes and the watch on his wrist that he came from a world very different from theirs. His shoes alone probably cost more than she made in a month cleaning offices. The walk home was arduous, with the man's dead weight supported between them. Their small terraced house seemed even more humble as they approached it, the paint peeling from the front door and the small garden overgrown from lack of time to tend it. But it was warm and dry, and that was what mattered now. Helen cleared the sofa of the mending she'd been working on and helped settle the stranger onto the worn cushions. Maisie fetched their best blankets, while Lydia filled a basin with warm water from the kettle. They didn't have much, but they had hands willing to help, and hearts big enough to care for a stranger in need. "Will he be all right, Mum?" Lydia asked, as Helen gently cleaned the blood from the man's forehead. "I think so, sweetheart. The cut isn't as bad as it looked. He's probably just concussed." Helen had learned basic first aid during her brief stint working at a care home years ago, before the girls were born. "We'll keep an eye on him tonight and call for help in the morning if he doesn't wake up." The man's breathing had already improved since they'd brought him inside, and some color was returning to his pale cheeks. Helen found herself studying his face as she worked. He was handsome in a refined way, with strong features that spoke of privilege and education. His hands were soft, unmarked by manual labor, and his nails were perfectly maintained. As the evening wore on, the twins took turns watching over their unexpected guest, while Helen prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread. The storm continued to rage outside, making the warmth of their small home feel even more precious. They might not have much, but they had each other, and tonight they had the satisfaction of knowing they'd done the right thing. "What do you think he does for work?" Maisie wondered aloud as they ate their dinner, glancing occasionally at the sleeping figure on their sofa. "Something important, I'd guess," Helen replied, noting the quality of his clothes and the expensive watch. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that he's safe and warm." The twins nodded, their young faces serious with the weight of their shared responsibility. They might live in a world where every penny counted, where second-hand clothes and careful budgeting were facts of life, but their mother had raised them to understand that kindness cost nothing and was worth everything. As Helen tucked a blanket more securely around their visitor and dimmed the lights, she had no way of knowing that this simple act of compassion would set in motion events that would test everything she believed about trust, protection, and the lengths a mother would go to keep her children safe. Dawn filtered through the thin curtains of Helen's sitting room as the stranger began to stir. Helen, who had spent the night in an uncomfortable chair beside the sofa, immediately leaned forward as she noticed his eyelids fluttering. She had dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check on him, her maternal instincts extending even to this unknown man. Where am I?" His voice was cultured with the kind of accent Helen associated with private schools and university education. As his eyes focused on her face, she saw intelligence there and something else, surprise at finding himself in such humble surroundings. "You're safe," Helen said gently. "You had an accident in the storm last night. We brought you here to our home." The man struggled to sit up, wincing as he touched the bandage Helen had fashioned from a clean tea towel. His gaze swept the small room, taking in the second-hand furniture, the mended cushions, the modest television in the corner. When his eyes returned to Helen's face, there was something unreadable in his expression. "I'm Rupert," he said finally. "Rupert Ashworth. And you are—" "Helen. Helen Morrison. These are my daughters, Lydia and Maisie." The twins had appeared in the doorway, curious about their overnight guest but maintaining a respectful distance. Rupert's eyes lingered on the girls for a moment longer than Helen felt comfortable with, but she dismissed the feeling as her own imagination. He had just regained consciousness, after all. It was natural that he might seem a bit unfocused. Over the next few days, as Rupert recovered from his concussion, Helen found herself oddly charmed by their unexpected houseguest. He was unfailingly polite, insisting on helping with small tasks despite her protests. He praised her simple cooking as if it were gourmet cuisine and showed genuine interest in the girls' schoolwork. "I can't remember the last time I felt such peace," he confided to Helen one evening as they sat in the small kitchen after dinner. The twins were upstairs doing homework, and the house had settled into its evening quiet. "Your home has something that mine lacks, despite all its expensive furnishings." Helen found herself blushing at the compliment. It had been years since anyone had appreciated what she worked so hard to provide for her daughters. As a single mother working multiple cleaning jobs, she rarely heard praise for her efforts. Rupert proved to be an excellent storyteller, regaling them with tales of his travels and business dealings. He spoke of offices in London's financial district, of meetings with important people whose names Helen recognized from the news. The girls listened with wide eyes, captivated by glimpses of a world so different from their own. "What do you do for work, Mr. Ashworth?" Lydia asked one evening, her homework spread across the kitchen table. "I invest in companies, help them grow," Rupert explained with a smile. "I suppose you could say I help create opportunities for people." Helen noticed how he made everything sound noble, purposeful. There was something magnetic about his confidence, the way he seemed to inhabit space as if he owned it. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the way he listened to her talk about her dreams for the girls' futures. "You're remarkable, Helen," he told her one night as she served him tea in her best china cup, a wedding gift from her mother that she rarely used. "Raising two such intelligent, beautiful daughters on your own. You should be proud." The compliments felt like warm honey, soothing wounds Helen hadn't even realized were still tender. When had anyone last told her she was doing a good job? When had anyone seen past the worn clothes and tired face to recognize her strength? "The girls are everything to me," she admitted. "I just want them to have opportunities I never had. Lydia's so bright, and Maisie has such potential, if only what?" Helen hesitated, then found herself opening up about her fears and hopes. About working 2 jobs to keep them afloat, about lying awake at night worrying about university fees, and whether her daughters would be trapped in the same cycle of struggle that had defined her own life. Rupert listened with what seemed like genuine compassion, nodding at the right moments, asking thoughtful questions. By the time he was ready to leave, Helen felt as if she'd made a real friend, perhaps even something more, though she hardly dared acknowledge that thought. "You've given me something precious," Rupert said as he prepared to call for a car to take him back to his world. "You've reminded me what really matters: family, love, simple human decency." He paused at the door, looking back at Helen and the girls with an expression of deep emotion. "I meant what I said, Helen. You have no idea how much you've changed my perspective on life. This isn't goodbye. It's the beginning of something wonderful." As Helen watched his expensive car disappear into the distance, she felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. She had no way of knowing that Rupert's words, spoken with such apparent sincerity, were the opening moves in a game far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. True to his word, Rupert called the very next day. Helen's old mobile phone buzzed during her lunch break at the office building where she worked, startling her from her usual routine of eating a sandwich alone in the supply closet. "Helen, my dear, I've been thinking about our conversation," his warm voice filled her ear. "About the girls' futures, I'd like to help." Helen's grip tightened on the phone. "That's very kind, Rupert, but we couldn't possibly. Please, hear me out. I have connections, resources. Lydia could have private tutoring with the best teachers in Manchester. Maisie could join an exclusive online program for gifted young people. Consider it my way of paying back your incredible kindness." The offer was overwhelming. Helen found herself speechless, torn between pride and the desperate hope that had lived in her chest for years, the hope that somehow, someday, her daughters might escape the limitations that had defined her own life. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes, Helen. Let me give your daughters the opportunities they deserve." Within a week, Helen's modest home was transformed. Delivery trucks appeared daily, bringing packages that seemed almost magical in their contents. Expensive laptops arrived for both girls. Along with tablets, high-quality notebooks, and educational materials Helen had only dreamed of being able to afford. Lydia's private tutor was a distinguished woman from Oxford, who specialized in classical literature and advanced mathematics. She arrived twice a week in a sleek car, carrying leather briefcases filled with challenging assignments and sophisticated learning materials. Maisie's online program connected her with other gifted teenagers from around the world. Helen watched in amazement as her daughter engaged in video calls with young people from New York, Tokyo, and Sydney, discussing complex topics with a confidence that took Helen's breath away. "Mum, look at this," Maisie called from the kitchen table one evening. Her new laptop opened to a beautifully designed web page. "We're working on a project about renewable energy with kids from 6 different countries." Lydia, meanwhile, was devouring books Helen had never heard of, writing essays that seemed far beyond her 15 years, and discussing philosophy with her tutor as if she'd been born to such conversations. But it wasn't just educational materials that arrived. Expensive clothes appeared. Tasteful, well-made items that transformed the girls' appearances. New school bags, quality shoes, even jewelry that seemed too sophisticated for teenagers. Helen tried to protest, but Rupert waved away her concerns with gentle laughter. "They're young ladies now, Helen. They deserve to look the part," he said, during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "Besides, first impressions matter in the circles they'll soon be moving in." A car service was arranged to transport the girls to their various activities. Helen watched from her window as sleek vehicles pulled up outside their modest terraced house, drawing curious stares from neighbors. The drivers were always polite, professional, but Helen couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too fast. Still, the results were undeniable. Both girls were thriving academically, gaining confidence, discovering talents they'd never had the chance to explore. Helen found herself torn between gratitude and a growing unease she couldn't quite articulate. "You seem troubled," Rupert observed one evening as they sat in Helen's small garden. The girls were inside, working on their respective assignments, and the summer air was soft around them. It's so much," Helen admitted. "I keep wondering what you're getting out of all this." Rupert's smile was understanding, almost paternal. "I'm getting the satisfaction of helping a family that showed me true kindness when I needed it most. Helen, you saved my life that night. You brought me into your home, cared for me without expecting anything in return. This is simply my way of saying thank you." His words were reasonable, his manner sincere. But late at night, when Helen lay in her narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of prosperity around her, the hum of expensive electronics, the rustle of quality fabrics, she found herself wondering if kindness could really be this valuable. She tried to push away the nagging voice in her head that whispered warnings she couldn't quite understand. After all, what harm could come from education, from opportunities, from the chance to give her daughters everything she'd always wanted for them? The voice grew quieter as the days passed, drowned out by the girl's excitement, by Rupert's gentle persistence, and by her own desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, their lives really had changed for the better. If Helen had listened more carefully to that inner voice, if she had paid closer attention to the way Rupert's eyes lingered on her daughters, if she had questioned why a wealthy man would invest so much in a family he barely knew, the events that followed might have unfolded very differently. But hope, once kindled in a mother's heart, burns bright enough to blind even the most careful guardian to dangers that hide in plain sight. At first, the changes in Lydia and Maisie seemed entirely positive. Their confidence soared as they excelled in their new academic pursuits, and Helen felt a deep satisfaction watching her daughters blossom in ways she had only dreamed possible. But as weeks turned into months, subtle shifts began to appear that made Helen's maternal instincts prickle with unease. Lydia, who had always been chatty and open with her mother, began spending more time in her room. When Helen asked about her day, her responses became shorter, more guarded. The bright enthusiasm that had initially marked her private tutoring sessions started to fade, replaced by a quiet compliance that didn't feel quite right. "How was your lesson with Ms. Richardson today?" Helen asked one evening, as Lydia pushed food around her plate without eating. "Fine," Lydia replied, not meeting her mother's eyes. "She says I'm making good progress." But there was something hollow in her daughter's voice, a flatness that hadn't been there before. Helen noticed that Lydia had started wearing the expensive clothes Rupert had provided even around the house, as if she were constantly preparing for some unseen audience. Maisie's changes were different but equally concerning. The confident girl who had eagerly participated in international video calls began making excuses to avoid them. She became jumpy, startling at unexpected sounds, and Helen caught her several times staring out the window with an expression of worry that seemed far too mature for her young face. "Is everything all right with your online program, sweetheart?" Helen asked one afternoon as she found Maisie sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop closed despite having a scheduled session. "I'm just tired today," Maisie said quickly. "Can I skip it?" Helen agreed, but noted this was the third time in 2 weeks that Maisie had asked to avoid her program activities. The girl who had once been excited to connect with peers around the world now seemed anxious about any form of digital interaction. Rupert's visits, meanwhile, had become more frequent and more intrusive. What had initially been polite check-ins on the girl's progress evolved into lengthy stays that stretched well into the evening. He would arrive unannounced, letting himself into their home with a familiarity that made Helen increasingly uncomfortable. During these visits, Helen noticed how Rupert's attention focused intently on her daughters. He would ask them detailed questions about their daily routines, their friends, their thoughts and feelings. His interest seemed to go beyond the natural concern of a benefactor checking on his investment. "You're growing into such beautiful young women," she overheard him tell the twins one evening. "You must be starting to notice how boys look at you now." The comment made Helen's blood run cold. There was something in his tone, something inappropriate about a grown man discussing her 15-year-old daughter's developing bodies and romantic awareness. When she confronted him later, Rupert's response was smooth and dismissive. "Helen, you're being overly protective. The girls are growing up. Someone needs to prepare them for the realities of adult relationships." But Helen's discomfort only grew as she noticed other troubling patterns. Rupert began suggesting that the girls might benefit from spending time at his home, with its superior educational resources and quiet environment. He spoke of private study sessions, weekend academic retreats, opportunities that would require the girls to be alone with him for extended periods. "I have a beautiful library," he told Lydia one evening, his hand resting on her shoulder just a moment too long. "You could spend hours there, surrounded by first editions and original manuscripts. I'd love to show you my collection personally." Helen watched her daughter's reaction carefully. Lydia's smile seemed forced, and she subtly moved away from Rupert's touch. But when Helen asked her about it later, Lydia insisted everything was fine. "He's just trying to help us, Mum," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We should be grateful." That phrase, "we should be grateful," began appearing frequently in both girls' conversations. It was as if they were repeating something they'd been told, a mantra designed to silence their own instincts and concerns. Helen's unease crystallized one evening when she returned home early from work to find Rupert alone in the house with the girls. She had assumed he wasn't there, as his car wasn't visible from the street, but as she approached the front door she could hear voices from inside. "Now, this will just be between us," Rupert was saying in a low, intimate tone that made Helen's skin crawl. "Some things are too special to share with everyone, even mothers who love us very much." Helen's key seemed to make an unusually loud noise as she opened the door, and by the time she entered the sitting room, Rupert was standing at an appropriate distance from the girls, his expression pleasant and normal. "Helen, what a lovely surprise. I was just reviewing the girls' progress reports with them." But both Lydia and Maisie looked pale and shaken, and neither would meet their mother's eyes. That night, Helen heard soft crying from their shared bedroom. But when she went to check on them, both girls pretended to be asleep. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were beginning to form in Helen's mind. But she found herself paralyzed by doubt and fear. Rupert was so charming, so apparently generous. He had given them so much, opened doors she could never have opened herself. How could she accuse him of something so terrible based on feelings and intuitions? But as Helen lay awake that night, listening to her daughter's restless sleep, she knew that her instincts were screaming warnings she could no longer ignore. The man she had saved from a storm, the man she had welcomed into their home and their lives, was not the benefactor he pretended to be. The question that haunted her was whether she had the courage to act on her suspicions, and whether she could protect her daughters before it was too late. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Helen had been working late at the office complex, scrubbing floors and emptying bins, while her mind churned with growing anxiety about her daughters. The expensive gifts, the private lessons, Rupert's increasingly possessive behavior, it all felt like a trap closing around her family, but she still couldn't bring herself to believe the worst. She arrived home to find the house strangely quiet. Usually the girls would be at the kitchen table doing homework or chattering about their day, but tonight there was only silence. Helen called out as she hung up her coat, but received no response. She found Lydia in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with tears streaming down her face. Her daughter's usual composure had completely crumbled, and she looked younger than her 15 years, vulnerable and frightened in a way that made Helen's heart clench with protective fury. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Helen knelt beside her daughter, gently touching her shoulder. For a long moment, Lydia just shook her head, unable to speak through her sobs. When she finally found her voice, the words came out in a broken whisper that would haunt Helen for the rest of her life. "He wants me to come to his house this weekend," Lydia said, her voice barely audible. "Alone. He says I need special tutoring that can only happen there in private. He keeps talking about how mature I am, how I'm becoming such a beautiful woman. The way he looks at me, Mum, it makes me feel sick inside." Helen felt the world tilt around her as her worst fears crystallized into terrible reality. Has he touched you?" "Not yet," Lydia whispered. "But I think he wants to. He stands too close. He finds excuses to put his hands on my shoulders, to adjust my posture when I'm reading. Last week he told me I should start thinking about what kind of woman I want to become, and he offered to teach me things that most girls my age don't know." Helen's vision blurred with rage, but she forced herself to stay calm for her daughter's sake. "Where's Maisie?" "In our room. She's scared too, but she's afraid to tell you." Helen found her younger daughter curled up on her bed, clutching a pillow to her chest. Maisie's eyes were red from crying, and she looked up at her mother with an expression of relief mixed with terror. "Maisie, love, I need you to tell me what's been happening." The story that emerged was even worse than Helen had imagined. Rupert had been gradually increasing his inappropriate behavior with both girls over several weeks. He had touched Maisie's back and shoulders during their tutoring sessions, making comments about her developing body. He had suggested private photography sessions to capture her natural beauty, and had shown her pictures of other young girls he claimed to have helped. "He said I was special," Maisie said through her tears. "He said most people wouldn't understand our relationship, but that I was mature enough to keep secrets. He made it sound like it would be wrong to tell you, like you might not understand how important our education is." Helen felt physically sick as she listened to her daughters describe the classic grooming techniques Rupert had been using. The gifts, the special attention, the gradual boundary violations, the creation of secrets and shame. It was textbook predatory behavior, and she had been completely blind to it. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, pulling both girls into her arms. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." "We tried to tell ourselves it was normal," Lydia said. "He's done so much for us. We thought maybe we were imagining things or being ungrateful." That evening, Helen made the most difficult phone call of her life. Her hands shook as she dialed Rupert's number, knowing she needed to confront him while her daughters were safe upstairs. "Helen, how lovely to hear from you." Rupert's voice was warm and familiar, the same tone that had once made her feel special and appreciated. "I know what you've been doing to my daughters," Helen said, her voice steadier than she felt. There was a pause, and when Rupert spoke again, his tone had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said smoothly. "I've been nothing but generous to your family. Perhaps you should be more grateful for everything I've done for you." "Stay away from my daughters," Helen said firmly. Rupert's laugh was soft and menacing. "Helen, I think you're forgetting something important. Your daughters' futures depend on my generosity. Their education, their opportunities, their chance to escape the poverty you've trapped them in, all of that comes from me. You should be very careful before making accusations you can't prove." The threat was clear, and Helen felt a chill of fear run down her spine. But stronger than her fear was the protective fury that had been building inside her for weeks. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm simply reminding you of reality," Rupert replied. "I could end all of this tomorrow. The tutoring, the programs, the financial support, all gone. Your daughters would go back to their mediocre state school, their limited prospects, their inevitable slide into the same life of struggle you've lived. Is that really what you want for them?" Helen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices, but when she opened them again, her resolve was unshakable. "My daughter's safety is worth more than anything you could ever give us," she said quietly. "Don't contact us again." As she hung up the phone, Helen knew the real battle was just beginning. Rupert had wealth, power, and connections she could never match, but she had something he would never understand: a mother's absolute determination to protect her children, no matter the cost. The days following Helen's confrontation with Rupert were among the darkest of her life. True to his threats, he immediately withdrew all financial support. The expensive laptops and tablets were collected by a delivery service. The private tutors stopped coming. The car service disappeared overnight, leaving the girls to walk to school again in their worn shoes and mended clothes. But worse than the material losses was the psychological toll. Both Lydia and Maisie struggled with guilt and self-blame, wondering if they had somehow invited Rupert's inappropriate attention. They worried about their educational future, about the opportunities they were losing, about whether their mother had made the right choice. "Maybe we misunderstood," Maisie said one evening as they sat around their small kitchen table, eating beans on toast for dinner. "Maybe he really was just trying to help us." Helen's heart broke at her daughter's words. She recognized the confusion and self-doubt that victims often experienced, the way predators manipulated their targets into questioning their own perceptions and instincts. "No, sweetheart," Helen said firmly. "You didn't misunderstand anything. What he was doing was wrong, and it wasn't your fault." But Helen knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. She needed evidence, proof that would stand up against Rupert's wealth and influence. She needed help, but she wasn't sure where to find it. The answer came from an unexpected source. Jimmy Patterson had worked alongside Helen at the office complex for 3 years, a quiet man in his 60s who emptied bins and mopped floors with methodical precision. He had always been kind to Helen, sometimes sharing his newspaper during lunch breaks and asking about her daughters with genuine interest. When Jimmy noticed Helen's distress during their shift one evening, he gently asked if she needed someone to talk to. Helen found herself pouring out the whole story, desperate for someone to believe her, someone to tell her she wasn't going crazy. Jimmy listened without judgment, his weathered face growing increasingly grave as Helen described Rupert's behavior. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "My daughter went through something similar when she was about your girl's age," he said quietly. "Different circumstances, but the same kind of manipulation. I know how hard it is to prove, especially when the man has money and connections." Jimmy reached into his cleaning cart and pulled out a small device Helen had never noticed before. "Voice recorder," he explained. "I use it to keep track of supply orders and maintenance schedules, but it's got good quality recording capability." Helen stared at the device, understanding immediately what he was suggesting. "You think I should try to get him to confess? I think predators like this don't stop with one family," Jimmy said, "and I think they get cocky, especially when they think they've got their victims intimidated. If you could get him talking." The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. Helen would call Rupert and suggest a meeting, ostensibly to discuss the possibility of resuming the girls' educational support. She would wear the recording device and try to get him to reveal his true intentions. "Are you sure about this?" Jimmy asked, as they tested the device during their next shift together. Men like this can be dangerous when they feel cornered. Helen thought about her daughters, about the fear in their eyes, about all the other young girls who might become Rupert's targets if he wasn't stopped. "I have to try," she said. 2 days later, Helen sat in an upscale cafe in Manchester city centre, the tiny recording device hidden in her handbag. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for Rupert to arrive, but her resolve was unshakable. When he walked in, Helen was struck by how normal he looked. Well-dressed, confident, charming. The same man who had seemed like a savior just months earlier. He smiled warmly as he approached her table, as if their last conversation had never happened. "Helen, how wonderful to see you," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I was so pleased when you called. I hoped you'd had time to reconsider our little misunderstanding." "I've been thinking about what you said," Helen replied carefully. "About the girls' futures, about what they might be giving up." Rupert's smile widened. "I knew you'd come to your senses. You're a practical woman, Helen. You understand that opportunities like this don't come along often for families in your situation." As the conversation progressed, Helen felt sick at how easily Rupert revealed his manipulative nature. He spoke about the girls as if they were commodities, investments he had made that he expected to pay dividends. He made thinly veiled references to the special attention he planned to give them, the private lessons that would help them mature into the kind of women he appreciated. "Of course, this arrangement would require a certain level of trust," Rupert said, his voice taking on the intimate tone Helen had learned to fear. "The girls would need to understand that our relationship is special, something that others might not appreciate. There would need to be discretion." Helen forced herself to nod, to play along while the recording device captured every damning word. When Rupert began describing specific plans for private weekends with her daughters, detailing the kind of education he wanted to provide them, Helen had to excuse herself to the bathroom to keep from being physically sick. But she got what she came for. Nearly 40 minutes of recorded conversation in which Rupert revealed himself to be exactly the predator Helen had suspected. His arrogance, his sense of entitlement, his complete lack of concern for her daughter's well-being. It was all there, captured in his own words. As Helen left the cafe that day, she knew she had taken the first crucial step in protecting not just her own daughters, but potentially countless other young girls. The recording in her handbag felt like a weapon of hope, proof that even the most powerful predators could be brought down by the courage of the mothers who refused to let them win. With Jimmy's encouragement and the damning recording in her possession, Helen knew she needed professional help to ensure justice was served. She spent hours researching investigative journalists in the Manchester area, looking for someone with experience in sensitive cases involving powerful predators. Sarah Chen from BBC Northwest had built a reputation for her fearless reporting on abuse cases, particularly those involving individuals who used their wealth and influence to escape consequences. When Helen called the BBC offices, hands shaking as she explained her situation, Sarah immediately agreed to meet. They sat in a small interview room at the BBC building, Helen's voice barely above a whisper as she played the recording and shared her daughter's experiences. Sarah listened with the professional composure of someone who had heard similar stories before, but Helen could see the anger burning in her eyes. "This is exactly the kind of predatory behavior we've been investigating," Sarah said when the recording ended. "Mr. Ashworth's name has come up in our research before, but we've never had concrete evidence or victims willing to go on record." Helen felt a chill of vindication mixed with horror. "There are others?" "We believe so, but proving it has been nearly impossible. Men like Ashworth are very careful about covering their tracks. They target vulnerable families, create dependency, and then exploit the fear and shame their victims feel." Sarah explained the process of building a case that would stand up to legal scrutiny and public attention. It would require careful documentation, additional evidence, and the courage to face Rupert's inevitable attempts to discredit and intimidate them. "I won't lie to you, Helen," Sarah said. "This won't be easy. He'll use every resource at his disposal to make this go away. Are you prepared for that?" Helen thought about her daughters, about their bravery in telling her the truth, about all the unknown girls who might be suffering in silence. "We have to be," she said firmly. The investigation that followed was methodical and thorough. Sarah's team began by verifying Helen's story, interviewing the girls with trained counselors present, and documenting the timeline of Rupert's grooming behavior. They spoke with Jimmy, who confirmed Helen's distress and provided context for how the recording was obtained. More importantly, Sarah's initial reporting began to flush out other victims. Within weeks of the story's initial publication, 3 other families came forward with remarkably similar experiences. Each story followed the same pattern: a wealthy benefactor offering educational opportunities, gradual boundary violations, and threats when parents became suspicious. Maria Santos, a single mother from Oldham, described how Rupert had approached her family after her son won a local science fair. "He promised my boy a scholarship to a prestigious boarding school," she said during a recorded interview. "But the private meetings, the weekend trips he suggested, something felt wrong. When I questioned him, he said I was being paranoid and ungrateful." Another family, the Williamses from Stockport, had a daughter who received art supplies and private lessons from Rupert. "He said she had exceptional talent," Mrs. Williams recalled, "but he wanted to photograph her for a portfolio. When we saw some of the poses he suggested, we cut contact immediately. He tried to sue us for breach of an informal agreement." The most heartbreaking testimony came from Jennifer Park, whose daughter had been involved with Rupert's mentorship program 2 years earlier. "My daughter still won't talk about what happened during those private study sessions," Jennifer said through tears, "but she's been in therapy ever since. We moved to Scotland to get away from him." As the investigation expanded, financial records revealed the scope of Rupert's operation. He had been running what amounted to a grooming network, using his wealth to identify vulnerable families and gain access to their children. The pattern was always the same: educational opportunities as bait, gradual isolation of the victims, and psychological manipulation to maintain control. Detective Inspector Rebecca Morrison, no relation to Helen, was assigned to the criminal investigation that emerged from Sarah's reporting. A specialist in child protection cases, she brought years of experience in prosecuting predators who used their social status as camouflage. "What Mr. Ashworth was doing represents a sophisticated form of child exploitation," D.I. Morrison explained to Helen during one of their interviews. "He was using his wealth and social position to create a facade of respectability while systematically targeting vulnerable children." The legal case began to build momentum as more evidence emerged. Digital forensics experts discovered that Rupert had been maintaining detailed files on the families he targeted, including photographs of the children, personal information about their financial situations, and notes about their vulnerabilities. Most damning of all was a private journal found during a search of his home office. In his own handwriting, Rupert had documented his selection criteria for potential victims and described his grooming techniques with clinical detachment. He wrote about the investment value of different children and rated their families based on their likelihood to remain silent if threatened. The public response to Sarah's initial article was immediate and overwhelming. The story was shared thousands of times on social media with the hashtag #NobodyTouches, my daughters trending nationally. Other journalists picked up the story, and soon Rupert's face was appearing on news programs across the country. Helen found herself thrust into the spotlight in ways she had never imagined. Reporters camped outside her modest home, seeking interviews and updates on the case. While some of the attention felt overwhelming, Helen was amazed by the outpouring of support from complete strangers. Letters and emails poured in from parents across the country, sharing their own experiences and thanking Helen for her courage. A crowdfunding campaign set up by supporters raised enough money to help cover legal expenses and provide some financial stability, while Helen took time off work to deal with the case. "You've given voice to so many families who felt powerless," wrote one mother from Leeds. "My daughter went through something similar with a different man, and seeing your strength has helped us finally report it to the police." The psychological support was equally important. Counselors specializing in trauma therapy began working with Lydia and Maisie, helping them process their experiences and understand that they were not to blame for what had happened. Support groups connected them with other young survivors, showing them they were not alone. As the weeks passed, Helen watched her daughters begin to heal. The guilt and self-doubt that had plagued them started to fade, replaced by a growing understanding of their own strength and resilience. They began speaking at school assemblies about recognizing predatory behavior, turning their traumatic experience into a tool for protecting others. "I want other kids to know the warning signs we missed," Lydia said during one interview. "I want them to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, even if the adult seems nice and generous." The community response was equally powerful. Teachers began receiving training on recognizing grooming behavior, and parents organized information sessions about keeping children safe from predators who used gifts and opportunities as weapons. Local businesses rallied around Helen's family, offering job opportunities and support that didn't come with hidden agendas. The genuine outpouring of community care stood in stark contrast to Rupert's manipulative generosity, showing Helen what real support looked like. But perhaps most importantly, the case began to change how society talked about predatory behavior. Instead of focusing on what victims should have done differently, the conversation shifted to holding perpetrators accountable and recognizing the sophisticated tactics they used to exploit trust and vulnerability. The trial of Rupert Ashworth began on a grey Monday morning in March, nearly 8 months after Helen first confronted him about his behavior toward her daughters. The courtroom was packed with journalists, supporters, and other families whose lives had been affected by his predatory actions. Helen sat in the witness stand, her voice steady as she recounted the events that had brought them to this moment. She described the night they had rescued Rupert from his overturned car, their family's kindness to a stranger, and how he had systematically exploited that generosity to gain access to her daughters. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Diana Hartwell, methodically presented evidence of Rupert's grooming techniques. The recording Helen had made was played in its entirety, filling the courtroom with Rupert's own words as he described his intentions toward the girls. Several jurors looked visibly disturbed as they heard him speak about children as if they were objects for his gratification. "Mr. Ashworth used his wealth and social position as weapons," Prosecutor Hartwell told the jury during her opening statement. "He identified vulnerable families, gained their trust through seemingly generous offers of help, and then exploited that trust to access their children for his own predatory purposes." The defense team, expensive lawyers hired by Rupert's company, attempted to portray him as a misunderstood philanthropist whose good intentions had been twisted by desperate families seeking financial gain. They suggested that Helen had fabricated evidence and coached her daughters to lie about their experiences. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Digital evidence showed the scope of Rupert's operation, including encrypted files containing photographs and personal information about dozens of children. Expert witnesses testified about grooming patterns and psychological manipulation techniques that matched exactly what the victims had described. Most powerfully, several of Rupert's victims took the stand to describe their experiences. Now adults, they spoke with courage about the long-term psychological damage his abuse had caused. Their testimonies painted a picture of a man who had been preying on vulnerable children for over a decade, always careful to target families who were unlikely to be believed if they spoke out. "He made me feel special at first," testified Rebecca Chen, now 23 years old. "He said I was more mature than other girls my age, that I deserved opportunities they didn't. By the time I realized what was happening, I was so isolated and confused that I didn't know how to ask for help." The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which Rupert maintained his innocence despite the mounting evidence. He sat in the dock with the same composed expression he had worn during his visits to Helen's home, as if he still believed his wealth and status would protect him from consequences. When the jury returned with their verdict after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the courtroom was silent. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, and Helen felt years of tension finally release from her shoulders. Judge Patricia Thornton sentenced Rupert to 12 years in prison, with additional charges pending from other jurisdictions where victims had come forward. In her sentencing remarks, she made it clear that his abuse of trust and exploitation of vulnerable families warranted the harshest possible penalty. "You used your privileged position to prey upon children whose families trusted you," Judge Thornton said, looking directly at Rupert. "You caused immeasurable harm not just to your direct victims, but to their families and communities. The sentence reflects the serious nature of your crimes and society's condemnation of your actions." The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Rupert's company immediately distanced itself from him, implementing new safeguarding policies and establishing a victim support fund. His personal assets were frozen pending civil lawsuits from multiple families. More importantly, the case sparked legislative changes. New laws were passed requiring background checks for anyone offering private educational services to children, and reporting requirements were strengthened for organizations working with young people. Helen found herself at the center of a movement that was changing how society protected children from predators. She was invited to speak at conferences about child protection, sharing her story and helping train professionals to recognize grooming behavior. "The most important thing I learned," Helen told one audience of teachers and social workers, "is that predators count on our shame and silence. They want us to feel grateful for their attention, guilty for questioning their motives, and afraid to speak out against them. Breaking that silence is the most powerful weapon we have." 6 months after the trial, Helen accepted a position as a family liaison officer with the Greater Manchester Police, specializing in cases involving child exploitation. The job allowed her to use her experience to help other families navigate the complex process of reporting abuse and seeking justice. Lydia and Maisie, now 17, had not only recovered from their traumatic experience, but had become advocates in their own right. They started a support group for teenage survivors of grooming, providing peer counseling and educational resources to help other young people recognize and resist predatory behavior. Both girls had received full scholarships to attend university, offers that came from legitimate institutions with proper safeguarding procedures. But more importantly, they had regained their confidence and trust in their own judgment. "We learned that being kind and trusting doesn't make you naive," Maisie explained during a school presentation. "But we also learned that real opportunities don't come with hidden costs or secret conditions. If someone tells you to keep their help secret from your parents, that's a red flag." The house that had once felt invaded by Rupert's presence was now a sanctuary again. Helen had redecorated the sitting room, where he had spent so many evenings manipulating her family, replacing the furniture and painting the walls a warm yellow that filled the space with light. On the mantelpiece sat a framed photograph of Helen with her daughters at the courthouse steps after Rupert's sentencing, all 3 of them smiling with the relief of survivors who had found justice. Next to it was a letter from one of the other families whose children had been saved because of their courage to speak out. The nightmare that had begun with an act of kindness on a stormy night had transformed into something powerful and positive. Helen's family had not just survived their encounter with a predator, they had helped create a world where other families would be safer. As Helen tucked her daughters into bed one evening, a ritual they had maintained despite their age, finding comfort in the simple acknowledgement of safety, she reflected on how much their lives had changed. "Are you proud of what we did, Mum?" Lydia asked quietly in the darkness. "I'm proud of your courage," Helen replied. "I'm proud that you trusted me enough to tell the truth, even when it was difficult, and I'm proud that we didn't let him win." The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibilities that were genuine and earned through their own strength and resilience. They had learned that true generosity didn't come with conditions, that real opportunities didn't require secrecy, and that a mother's love was indeed powerful enough to protect her children from even the most sophisticated predators. 2 years after Rupert Ashworth's conviction, Helen Morrison stood in her newly purchased home, hanging a piece of embroidered artwork on the freshly painted wall of her sitting room. The house was larger than their previous home, purchased with the proceeds from a book deal about their experience and Helen's new career in victim advocacy. The embroidery was simple but powerful, a photograph of Helen with Lydia and Maisie, all 3 of them smiling genuine smiles that spoke of healing and strength. Below the image, in careful stitching, were the words that had become their family motto, "Nobody touches my daughters." The phrase had taken on a life of its own, becoming a rallying cry for parents and protective adults around the world. It appeared on social media campaigns, support group materials, and legislation aimed at strengthening child protection laws. But for Helen, it remained deeply personal, a reminder of the moment she had chosen her daughter's safety over everything else. Lydia, now 19 and studying psychology at Manchester University, had chosen to specialize in trauma counseling. Her personal experience with grooming had inspired her to dedicate her career to helping other survivors heal and rebuild their lives. "I want to be the kind of counselor I needed when we were going through the worst of it," she had told Helen when announcing her career choice. "Someone who understands that healing isn't just about getting over what happened, but about reclaiming your power and using it to help others." Maisie, 18 and studying criminology at the same university, was focused on the legal and societal aspects of child protection. She had already published several articles in academic journals about the psychology of predators and the importance of believing child victims when they report abuse. Both girls lived at home while attending university, a choice they had made not out of fear, but out of the strong family bonds that had been strengthened by their shared experience. Their home had become a gathering place for other survivors and their families, a space where difficult conversations could happen safely and healing could occur in community. Helen's work with the Greater Manchester Police had expanded beyond individual cases to include policy development and training programs. She traveled regularly to speak at conferences, sharing the lessons learned from their experience and advocating for systematic changes in how society protected children. The ripple effects of their case continued to spread. Rupert's conviction had led to investigations in 3 other countries where he had operated similar schemes. Dozens of additional victims had been identified, and several had found the courage to press charges thanks to the precedent set by Helen's family. A documentary about their case had won several awards and been translated into multiple languages, spreading awareness about sophisticated grooming techniques to parents and children worldwide. Helen had donated the proceeds to establish a foundation providing legal support and counseling services to families dealing with child exploitation cases. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the simplest one. Other children were safe because of their courage to speak out. Helen regularly received letters from parents who had recognized warning signs because of the awareness raised by their case, and from young people who had trusted their instincts when adults behaved inappropriately toward them. On this particular evening, as Helen arranged furniture in their new home, the house filled with the comfortable sounds of her daughters preparing dinner and discussing their day. It was an ordinary moment of domestic peace, made precious by the knowledge of how easily it could have been lost. "Mum, do you ever regret saving him that night?" Maisie asked as they sat down to eat. It was a question that came up occasionally, usually when news reports mentioned other cases involving predators who had used kindness as a weapon. Helen considered the question carefully, as she always did. "I regret that he used our kindness against us," she said finally. "But I don't regret being the kind of people who would stop to help someone in need. The problem wasn't our compassion, it was his evil. And I'd rather live in a world where people help strangers than in one where everyone is too afraid to show kindness." Lydia nodded thoughtfully. "Besides, if we hadn't saved him, we never would have learned what he was doing to other families. Those other children might still be suffering in silence." It was a perspective that had helped all of them make peace with the randomness of how their ordeal had begun. Their act of compassion had been exploited, but it had also ultimately led to justice and protection for many other children. As evening settled over their new neighborhood, Helen reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had faced one of every parent's worst nightmares, the realization that someone they trusted was threatening their children's safety. But they had also discovered reserves of strength they hadn't known they possessed. The embroidered motto on their wall wasn't just a declaration of protection, it was a promise to themselves and to other families facing similar threats. It reminded them daily that love could triumph over manipulation, that truth could overcome lies, and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to be silenced. Helen Morrison had started as a single mother, working multiple cleaning jobs to support her daughters. She had become something much more powerful, a voice for the voiceless, a protector of the vulnerable, and living proof that no predator, no matter how wealthy or influential, was stronger than a mother's determination to keep her children safe. The night that had changed everything was now just a memory, but its lessons continued to shape their daily lives. They had learned to trust their instincts, to value genuine kindness over manipulative generosity, and to never again confuse gratitude with obligation. Most importantly, they had learned that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And at the top of that list, written in embroidered letters on their sitting room wall, was the truth that had guided them through their darkest moments and continued to light their way forward. "Nobody touches my daughters." In homes around the world, Other parents had adopted that same motto, creating a global network of protectors who refused to let predators operate in silence. Helen's story had become their story. Her courage had inspired their courage, and her victory had shown them that even the most vulnerable families could find the strength to fight back. The simple act of hanging a piece of embroidery on a wall had become something much larger, a symbol of resistance, a declaration of love, and a promise that would echo through generations of children who would grow up safer because one mother had refused to stay silent. "Nobody touches my daughters." 4 words that had changed everything. This powerful story of Helen Morrison and her daughters reminds us that a mother's love knows no boundaries when it comes to protecting her children. From a simple act of kindness on a stormy night to a courageous fight against a dangerous predator, this family's journey shows us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to stay silent. Helen's transformation from a struggling single mother to a fierce advocate for child protection proves that no amount of wealth or influence can overcome the determination of a parent fighting for their children's safety. If this story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughters touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with others who need to hear this important message. Stories like Helen's help raise awareness about predatory behavior and show other families that they're not alone in their struggles. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of resilience and justice. And tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? We'd love to know how far this message of protection and hope is reaching around the world.